The numbers swam before my eyes, a jumble of Greek letters and subscripts that refused to resolve into a coherent picture. I scratched out another line of calculus, the graphite smearing against the cheap, lined paper. The problem was a beast from the advanced section of the AP Physics textbook, far beyond what Mr. Finch had assigned, but I'd made a habit of tackling them. There was a quiet, methodical pleasure in reducing chaos to order, in finding the single, elegant solution hidden within a tangle of variables. The late afternoon sun slanted through the window of our small kitchen, illuminating dust motes dancing in the air and warming the back of my neck. My focus was a physical thing, a bubble of concentration that muted the world. The only sounds were the soft scratch of my pencil, the hum of the refrigerator, and the distant, rhythmic tick of the mantel clock in the living room. This was my sanctuary, this worn wooden table, its surface etched with the ghosts of 1,000 meals and homework assignments. I leaned in closer, my brow furrowed. The key was the conservation of energy, but the friction coefficient was throwing me off. I had to account for the energy dissipated as heat. "Lucas, you're going to burn a hole in that paper." My mother's voice, warm and slightly tired, broke the spell. I looked up as Sarah Mitchell came into the kitchen, still in her pale blue nurse's scrubs, a grocery bag in each arm. She smiled, the lines around her eyes crinkling. I jumped up to take the bags from her. "Just trying to conquer the unconquerable," I said, hefting the bags onto the counter. "Finch's extra credit." "Ah, the great Arthur Finch," she said, pulling a carton of milk from the bag. "Is the world still not intellectually stimulating enough for him? He says the assigned problems are for procedural competence. The real physics is in these." I gestured to my notebook. She shook her head fondly, unpacking groceries with efficient movements. "Well, this real physics is going to have to wait. I'm making lasagna, your favorite, and you're on onion duty." I took the proffered onion and cutting board, the sharp, clean smell filling my nostrils as I began to dice it. Cooking with my mom was one of our rituals. It was when we talked. The mindless repetition of chopping, stirring, seasoning gave way to real conversation. "So," she said, her back to me as she browned ground beef at the stove. "The mail came. I saw the big envelope." My heart did a slow, heavy roll in my chest. The big envelope. I'd been checking the mailbox with a frantic, daily urgency for weeks. The United States Naval Academy. It had been a long shot, a Hail Mary pass thrown against a future that otherwise looked like community college and a mountain of debt. My grades were top of the class, my SATs were stellar, but I wasn't a legacy. I didn't have a senator in my back pocket. I was just a kid from a working-class town, with a single mom who worked double shifts to keep the lights on. "Yeah," I said, my voice quieter than I intended. I finished the onion and wiped my hands on a dish towel. "It came." She turned around, her expression a careful neutral. "And?" I couldn't hold the smile back any longer. It broke across my face, a genuine, unguarded expression I rarely allowed myself. "I got in, Mom, I'm in." For a moment, she just stared at me. Then a sound escaped her, a half-laugh, half-sob, and she crossed the small space between us and pulled me into a tight hug. She smelled of hospital antiseptic, fabric softener, and the faint, familiar scent of her perfume. "Oh, Lucas, my brilliant boy, I knew it, I just knew it." She held me at arm's length, her eyes shining with tears. "Nuclear engineering. It's what you've always wanted." "It's a full ride," I said, the reality of it still sinking in. "Everything's covered. I won't have to." "Don't you dare finish that sentence," she said, her voice firm but gentle. "You were never a burden, you were the best thing that ever happened to me." She turned back to the stove, but I saw her swipe quickly at her eyes with the back of her hand. The sizzle of the meat filled the sudden silence. "It's just the military, Lucas. It's not just college. You'll be an officer. You could be sent anywhere." I knew this worry was coming. It was the shadow in the bright room of this acceptance. "It's the best nuclear engineering program in the country, Mom. Better than MIT, better than Stanford. And it's a guarantee of a job, a career, a real future." "I know, honey. I know the opportunities are incredible. It's just a mother's job to worry." She sprinkled oregano into the pan. "Have you told Mr. Finch yet?" "No, not yet. I wanted to tell you first." I paused, arranging my words. Arthur Finch's opinion mattered to me in a way I couldn't fully explain. He was the smartest person I'd ever met, a man who seemed to carry the entire history of scientific thought in his neatly combed head. His approval felt like a validation of my own mind, a sign that I belonged in the world of ideas I so desperately wanted to enter. "I'm going to see him after dinner. He stays late to grade on Tuesdays." "He'll be so proud," she said, but I detected a note of hesitation in her voice. My mother, pragmatic and perceptive, had never been entirely comfortable with my reverence for Mr. Finch. She found him a bit full of himself, as she'd politely put it once. We ate the lasagna at the small kitchen table, the cheesy, rich comfort food a stark contrast to the electric anticipation buzzing through me. We talked about practicalities, when I'd have to report for induction day, what the uniform allowance would cover, the brutal summer training known as plebe summer. My mother's questions were careful, practical, but the undercurrent of anxiety was always there. I did my best to project a confidence I didn't entirely feel, focusing on the sheer intellectual challenge that awaited me. After helping with the dishes, I grabbed the formal acceptance letter from my room, slipping it into a folder to keep it crisp. The walk to the high school was short, the spring air cool and carrying the scent of freshly cut grass. The building was mostly empty, a hollowed-out shell after the final bell. The halls, usually a river of shouting, laughing teenagers, were eerily quiet, my footsteps echoing on the polished linoleum. The door to room 214, Mr. Finch's physics lab, was slightly ajar. A sliver of warm light cut across the dim hallway. I peered in. Arthur Finch was at his desk, perched behind a fortress of textbooks and stacks of lab reports, a red pen in his hand. He was a man in his mid-60s, with a sharp, intelligent face and a head of thick, silver hair that he wore swept back. He had a way of sitting that suggested the chair was a temporary inconvenience, his posture rigid with intellectual authority. The setting sun bled through the large windows, casting long, distorted shadows of beakers and pendulums across the floorboards, painting the room in shades of orange and deep blue. I knocked softly on the doorframe. He looked up, peering over the top of his reading glasses. "Mitchell, I assumed you'd be celebrating the end of your secondary education with something less cerebral. What can I do for you?" His tone was dry, not unfriendly, but with that ever-present undercurrent of slight amusement, as if the world and its inhabitants were a mildly interesting experiment he was observing. I stepped into the room, the familiar smells of chalk dust and ozone from the Van de Graaff generator filling my senses. I got some news today. I wanted to share it with you." He placed his pen down deliberately. "News? I hope it involves your plans for tackling the fundamental limitations of the Standard Model. Your last essay on quantum decoherence, while derivative, showed a glimmer of promise." My heart was beating a little faster. This was it. "It's about college, sir. I heard back from my first choice." "Ah, the great migration." He steepled his fingers. "Let me guess. You applied to that state school's engineering program? Solid, practical, a sensible choice for your circumstances." There it was, the gentle, casual reminder of the world he believed I inhabited, the world of the sensible and the practical, a step below the hallowed halls of true academia. "Actually, sir, no." I took a breath, my fingers tightening on the folder. "I applied to the United States Naval Academy for nuclear engineering." For a long moment, he was silent. His expression didn't change, but I saw a subtle shift in his eyes, a flicker of something that wasn't surprise, but something closer to pity. "The Naval Academy," he repeated, the words flat. "Yes, sir, and I was accepted." I opened the folder and slid the letter onto his desk, the embossed seal of the academy gleaming in the twilight of the room. He picked it up, not with excitement or curiosity, but with the detached air of a pathologist examining a tissue sample. He scanned the letter, his lips pressed into a thin line. He didn't read it all. He placed it back on the desk, carefully aligning it with the corner. "Well," he said, taking off his glasses and polishing them with a handkerchief from his breast pocket. "Congratulations are in order, I suppose. It's a significant achievement, a testament to your discipline." The way he said discipline made it sound like a lesser quality, something separate from intellect. "Thank you, sir. Their program is top-ranked. I'll be studying under some of the best minds in reactor design." "Minds," he said, a faint, condescending smile touching his lips. "That's a generous term for what you'll find there, Mitchell. You will learn procedures, protocols. You will be trained like a very sophisticated technician to operate complex machinery. You will be taught to follow orders, but you will not receive an education. The words hit me with a physical force, knocking the air from my lungs. The quiet hum of the fluorescent lights above seemed to grow louder. I don't understand, sir. It's a rigorous academic program, the physics curriculum. The physics curriculum, he interrupted, his voice gaining an edge, will be applied physics. Engineering. It is physics in service of a tool, a weapon. It is not physics for the sake of understanding the universe. It is not the pure pursuit of knowledge. He leaned forward, his eyes boring into mine. A real education, Lucas, happens in a seminar room at Princeton or Chicago. It happens when you debate epistemology with a philosopher or deconstruct Milton with a literary critic. It's about learning how to think, not what to think. It's about joining a centuries-old conversation among intellectuals. The service academies, they produce soldiers, they produce managers, they do not produce scholars. I felt a hot flush creep up my neck. My carefully constructed future, the source of my immense pride just minutes ago, was being dismantled before my eyes, reduced to a vocational school for soldiers. They produce leaders, sir, and scientists. Do they? He picked up his red pen again, a clear dismissal. You have a first-rate mind, Mitchell, a truly first-rate mind. It's a pity to see it, conscripted, walled off from a genuine liberal arts education. You're choosing a trade school when you could have had an intellectual awakening. He looked down at the lab report in front of him, but I'm sure you'll be very successful. The finality in his voice was absolute. There was nothing more to say. I stood there, rooted to the spot, the congratulatory letter lying between us like an accusation. The shadows in the room seemed to deepen, swallowing the light. I felt small, foolish. The complex physics problem I'd been so proud of solving earlier now seemed like a child's puzzle. Thank you for your time, Mr. Finch, I managed to say, my voice thick. He gave a slight, dismissive nod without looking up. Good luck, Mitchell. I walked out of the classroom, the door clicking shut behind me with a sound of terrible finality. The echo of my footsteps in the empty hall was different now. They sounded hollow, lonely. I walked home in a daze, the vibrant spring evening feeling muted and gray. His words played on a loop in my head. A trade school, not a real education. A first-rate mind, conscripted. My mother was watching television in the living room when I got home. She took one look at my face and muted the sound. Lucas, what's wrong? I thought you were telling Mr. Finch your good news. I just shook my head and walked past her, straight to my room. I closed the door and sat on the edge of my bed, the acceptance letter feeling heavy in my hand. I unfolded it, reading the formal language again. The President of the United States, pleased to appoint the words that had filled me with such elation just hours before now felt like a verdict. Was he right? Was I trading the boundless horizon of pure knowledge for a set of instructions, a manual for a life of service? Was I shutting a door I didn't even know was open? I looked around my room. The shelves were lined with books on physics and astronomy, their spines worn from repeated reading. A model of the Saturn V rocket I'd built with my father before he left sat on my dresser. On my desk lay the notebook where I'd been working on that physics problem. I picked it up, staring at the elegant equations, the clean logic that had brought me so much satisfaction. This was real. This was mine. The clarity of a solved problem, the beauty of a fundamental law, this was what I loved. This was what I wanted to do. And Arthur Finch believed this path would lead me away from it. A cold, hard knot formed in my stomach, tightening until it eclipsed the hurt. The dismissal, the condescension, the sheer arrogance of his certainty, it wasn't just an opinion anymore. It was a challenge. He saw a limit where I saw a beginning. He saw a trade school where I saw the chance to master the most powerful forces on Earth. I stood up and walked to the window, looking out at the quiet street. The last of the sunset was a faint purple smudge on the horizon. I smoothed the acceptance letter out on the windowsill, my hand resting on the paper. The doubt he had planted was still there, a sharp splinter in my mind, but it was being surrounded, walled off by something harder, something more resilient. He was wrong, he had to be wrong, and I would prove it. Not with arguments, not with debates in seminar rooms, but with the work itself. With the relentless, methodical, principled pursuit of the very knowledge he claimed I was abandoning. The determination solidified inside me, no longer just an excited ambition, but a silent, fierce promise I made to myself, staring out at the gathering dark. I would go to that academy. I would learn everything they could teach me. And I would become an engineer that someone like Arthur Finch could never dismiss. The heat hit me first, a thick, wet blanket of Maryland humidity that made the wool of my new dress blues feel like a punitive measure. It was a physical presence, that heat, pressing down on the sea of identical white hats gathered on the asphalt parade deck. The noise was the second assault, a relentless cacophony of shouted commands, the sharp crack of heels on pavement, and a low, constant hum of anxiety that seemed to vibrate from the 200 other young men and women standing at rigid attention around me. My shirt was already plastered to my back, and the brim of my hat dug a furrow into my forehead. I stared at the back of the head in front of me, a close-cropped scalp already sunburned a painful pink, and tried to remember how to breathe. This was minute 15 of what felt like an eternal, motionless vigil. My mind, which had always been my refuge, my quiet engine room, felt like it had been scoured out and filled with static. The methodical certainty I found in solving a physics problem, the quiet comfort of chopping vegetables with my mom, it all felt like a dream from another life. All that existed was the heat, the pressure in my bladder, and the terrifying proximity of the upperclassmen, the detailers, who prowled the ranks like sharks, their eyes missing nothing. "Midshipman 4th Class Mitchell, your chin strap is uneven, fix it, now." The voice was inches from my ear, a bark that bypassed my ears and rattled my teeth. I fumbled with the stiff leather strap, my fingers suddenly clumsy and alien. I could feel the glare burning into the side of my face. This was plebe summer, and I was less than 3 hours in. The big envelope, the one that had arrived on our kitchen counter next to a dusting of flour, felt less like an acceptance letter and more like a sentencing document. For a dizzying second, Arthur Finch's smug, condescending face flickered in my memory. A trade school, Lucas. A vocational path for those who can't handle a true intellectual challenge. In that moment of hot, public humiliation, his words didn't feel like a motivator. They felt like a prophecy. The chaos didn't subside, it just changed form. We were herded to our rooms, a stark, impersonal space with 2 metal-framed beds, 2 desks, and a window overlooking a courtyard. My sea bag felt like it was filled with lead weights. I was just staring at the blank, gray wall, trying to muster the energy to unpack, when the door slammed open and another sea bag was tossed onto the vacant bed. "So, I hear they stick the brainiacs together to see if they'll spontaneously combust. You must be Mitchell." I turned. A guy my age, with an easy grin that seemed utterly out of place in this grim environment, stood in the doorway. He had a sharp, intelligent look in his eyes, and he'd already managed to get a smudge of dirt on his impeccably pressed white uniform. This was David Chen. "Spontaneous combustion requires a volatile reactant and an ignition source," I said, the words coming out flat, drained of any humor I'd intended. "I think the humidity here just induces slow, miserable melting." David's grin widened. A man after my own heart, already thinking in chemical equations. "I'm David, looks like we're cellmates." He dropped his bag and extended a hand. His grip was firm, confident. "I'm from San Diego. I thought I knew heat. This is something else entirely. It's like being steamed alive in a wool suit." That was the beginning. In the relentless grind of plebe summer, where every minute was accounted for, from the 5 a.m. wake-up call to the final exhausting push-ups before lights out, David was a fixed point of sanity. We learned the endless litany of plebe knowledge together, shouting the meal times of the day or the names of the academy's statues back at screaming detailers. We learned to march in perfect, mind-numbing unison. But at night, after the hallway outside our door fell silent, we'd talk in hushed tones. It was during one of those late-night sessions, a few weeks in, the scent of floor wax and sweat hanging in the air, that we found our footing. We were supposed to be memorizing the chain of command, but a thermodynamics problem from a handout was burning a hole in my notebook. "I can't get my head around this adiabatic expansion," I muttered, rubbing my eyes. "The professor's solution seems to skip 3 steps." David leaned over from his bed. "Let me see. Oh yeah, he's using the ideal gas law shortcut, but he's assuming constant specific heats, which is a load of crap for this temperature range. Here." He grabbed a pencil and, in a few elegant strokes on a piece of scrap paper, derived the integral form. You have to account for the variation. See. I looked at his work, a clean, logical procession of calculus that made perfect sense. It was beautiful. In the midst of all this enforced conformity, this deliberate breaking down of the individual, here was a spark of pure, unadulterated intellect. It was the first thing that had felt real in weeks. "You're good," I said, a genuine smile breaking through my exhaustion for the first time. "I know," he said, without a hint of arrogance, just simple fact. "So are you. Finch was wrong, you know." The name hit me like a splash of cold water. "What?" "Your high school physics teacher. The elitist guy you told me about, he was wrong." "This." David gestured around our tiny, barren room, but I knew he meant the whole academy, the immense pressure, the sheer volume of knowledge we were expected to master. "This isn't a trade school. This is a forge. They're not teaching us a trade, they're trying to build us into something that won't break under pressure. The intellectual rigor here is insane. It has to be. The mistakes we might make one day won't just mean a bad grade. They'll mean a billion-dollar warship dead in the water, or worse." He was right. The realization settled over me, heavy and significant. The physics I was learning here wasn't abstract theory, it was the literal force that would propel ships and power reactors. The calculus was the language of trajectories and stability. Every equation had weight. Every variable had consequence. The first year was a blur of survival. The second year, the structure eased, but the academic pressure intensified. We shed the constant harassment of the upperclassmen and stepped into classrooms where the stakes felt even higher. It was in my sophomore year reactor dynamics class that I met Commander Evelyn Rostova. She didn't enter the classroom so much as occupy it. She was of average height, with a posture so straight it seemed to defy gravity, and hair pulled back in a severe bun that highlighted the sharp lines of her face. She didn't need to raise her voice. Her presence, a quiet, focused intensity, silenced the room instantly. Her eyes, a piercing gray, scanned us, and I felt a strange sensation, as if she were already assessing the tensile strength of each person's character. "I am Commander Rostova," she began, her voice calm and precise, carrying to the back of the lecture hall without effort. "This is Reactor Principles. You will find the textbook adequate for the basics. I will teach you what the textbook cannot, how to think like an engineer who is responsible for a controlled nuclear fission reaction. There is no room for close enough in my classroom. There is correct, and there is wrong. A wrong answer here is a failure of imagination. On a submarine, a failure of imagination can mean you and your crew never see the sun again." She was as good as her word. The coursework was brutal, a relentless push into the heart of neutron flux, decay heat, and core design. I thrived on it. The methodical, precise nature of the work spoke to the core of who I was. For our first major project, a complex analysis of a hypothetical loss of coolant incident, I spent days in the library, cross-referencing textbooks with old reactor manuals I found in the archives. I turned in a 50-page report, confident I had nailed every variable. A week later, a slip of paper appeared in my mailbox. "Midshipman Mitchell, report to my office, 1600, Rostova." My stomach tightened. This couldn't be good. David gave me a sympathetic grimace. "Good luck. I heard she chews up second years and spits them out." At precisely 1600, I stood outside her office, my uniform perfectly pressed, and knocked. "Enter." Her office was sparse, functional. A desk, 2 chairs, and a bookshelf overflowing with technical manuals and bound reports. The only personal item was a framed photograph of a Lowe's Angels-class submarine breaking the surface of a turbulent gray sea. She was holding my report. She didn't invite me to sit. "Midshipman Mitchell, your analysis of the LOCA scenario." She dropped the thick report on her desk with a dismissive thud. "It is technically flawless. Your calculations are precise. Your methodology is sound." I stood there, waiting for the but. It hung in the air between us. "However," she said, finally looking up at me, her gaze was unnervingly direct. "You failed the assignment." I felt the blood drain from my face. "Ma'am, I don't understand. If the calculations are correct." "The assignment was not to solve an equation," she interrupted, her voice still quiet but now layered with steel. "The assignment was to manage a crisis. You focused exclusively on the neutronics and the thermal hydraulics of the core. You devoted 3 pages to the precise rate of temperature climb in the fuel rods. You devoted one sentence, a single sentence, to the fact that your primary coolant pump had just exploded. You treated it as a boundary condition. An input. It is not. It is the event. She stood up and came around the desk, leaning against it. She was shorter than me, but I felt like I was looking up at her. An engineer does not just manage the reactor. He manages the entire system. The mechanics scrambling to isolate the rupture, the electricians trying to restore auxiliary power, the sailors who are, at this moment, terrified because alarms are blaring and the deck plates are shaking. Your job is not just to keep the core from melting down. Your job is to project calm, to give clear, concise orders. To understand that the men and women in that engine room are part of your system, and their performance is a variable as important as the moderator temperature coefficient. You calculated the physics perfectly, midshipman. You failed the engineering. It was the most profound lesson I had ever learned. She hadn't just critiqued my work, she had redefined the entire scope of what it meant to be an engineer. It was about responsibility, about people, about the messy, terrifying reality that existed outside the clean lines of a differential equation. Arthur Finch taught me to solve for ex-Commander Rostova was teaching me that X had a family waiting for him back home. I worked with a new purpose after that. Rostova became my mentor, her office hours a grueling but exhilarating tutorial in systems thinking. She pushed me harder than anyone ever had, her belief in my potential expressed not through encouragement, but through ever-increasing expectations. The pressure was immense. There were nights I felt buried by the workload, the military obligations, the sheer mental fatigue. On one of those nights, during my junior year, a letter arrived from my mom. The academy's formal stationery felt crisp and impersonal in my hands, a contrast to the familiar, looping handwriting on the envelope. Dearest Lucas, it began. Another double shift today. The hospital was chaos, but it's quiet now. I'm sitting at the kitchen table with a cup of tea, and the house is too quiet. I keep expecting to hear you rustling around in your room, or the sound of you and David laughing about some complicated math problem I couldn't begin to understand. I miss you terribly, but every time I read your letters, my heart swells with such pride I think it might burst. You wrote about the pressure, about feeling like you're constantly being tested. I just want you to know that I see you. I see the man you're becoming, and it has nothing to do with grades or ranks. It's in the thoughtful way you write about your friends, the respect you have for Commander Rostova, the way you've shouldered this immense challenge without ever losing sight of who you are. Remember that determined boy who would sit at this very table for hours, working on a single physics problem until he got it right. That boy is still in there. That resilience is your core. Don't ever doubt that you belong there. You earned it. All my love. Mom. I folded the letter carefully, the paper soft from my touch. Her words were a lifeline, a touchstone of unconditional support that anchored me. I placed it in my desk drawer, right on top of the crumpled, mental image of Arthur Finch's dismissive smirk. The two existed in a perfect balance, one giving me the strength to endure, the other the fuel to prove something. The culmination of junior year was the reactor simulation practical. It was a rite of passage, a 4-hour ordeal in a mock-up of a submarine's control room, facing a cascading series of simulated failures. Commander Rostova would be observing, along with 2 other senior instructors. The simulation began calmly enough, but within 20 minutes, alarms started to blare. A primary steam line rupture. I fell into the rhythm, my hands moving across the panels, my voice calm as I called out readings and orders to David, who was my acting EOOW for the test. We stabilized it, only to be hit with a spurious scram signal and a failure of the emergency diesel generator. The temperature in the compartment climbed, a combination of real stress and the heat from the banks of computers running the simulation. I could feel Rostova's eyes on me, a physical pressure on the back of my neck. My mind raced, sifting through data, but I forced myself to slow down to breathe. I remembered her lesson. This wasn't just about the reactor. I directed David to get a status on the imaginary damage control team to confirm the backup batteries were online. I made a decision that went against the standard checklist, bypassing a failed sensor and relying on secondary indicators to initiate a manual cooldown procedure. It was a risk, but it was a calculated one, based on a deep understanding of the entire system, not just the reactor core. The frantic red lights on the panel flickered, then switched to a steady, calming green. The simulated crisis was over. The silence that followed was deafening, broken only by the hum of the computers and the ragged sound of my own breathing. The other instructors began packing up their notes, their faces unreadable. Commander Rostova remained seated. She looked at me for a long moment, her expression as inscrutable as ever. Then she gave a single, slow nod. "Adequate, Midshipman Mitchell," she said, but as she stood to leave, her hand briefly rested on my shoulder. The contact was fleeting, but the weight of it was immense. It wasn't praise, it was acknowledgement. It was respect. In that silent gesture, I felt the boy who had been humiliated on a hot parade deck 3 years earlier finally solidify into someone who could, indeed, handle the weight of the world. The Chesapeake Bay in late November has a bite that goes straight to the bone, a damp, insistent cold that the crisp autumn air of my memory never prepared me for. It whipped across the Terwilliger Brothers field, slicing through my service dress blue uniform as I stood at rigid attention, watching my plebes. My squad. 14 young men and women, their faces a mixture of exhaustion, determination, and the lingering terror of being new, their postures so straight it looked painful. I could feel the ghost of that pain in my own spine, a phantom ache from 4 years ago. Squad, attend HUT. My voice, once prone to cracking under pressure, now carried across the field with a sharp, confident bark that didn't sound like my own until I heard it. 14 sets of heels snapped together. 14 chins tilted up, eyes fixed on some distant point on the horizon, seeing nothing but the expectation of the next order. I paced slowly in front of them, my hands clasped behind my back, the gold stripes on my sleeve feeling less like an adornment and more like a part of my skin. The plebe summer they were enduring was a refined version of the chaos I'd survived. We'd learned from our own misery how to build them up without completely breaking them. At least, that's what Commander Rostova had drilled into us during our leadership seminars. The goal was to forge, not fracture. "The objective is simple," I said, my voice lower now, conversational yet cutting through the wind. "Navigate to the coordinates on your map using only the provided protractor and the stars you learned last week. No GPS, no comms, time is a factor. Midshipman Davies, you have the point. Lead your team." A young woman with a fierce glint in her eyes, Davies nodded sharply. "Aye, sir." I watched them move out, a clumsy but earnest organism, their voices a hushed chorus of bearings and calculations. This was the easy part. The hard part was back in my room, spread across my desk and half the floor, a 3-foot-long schematic of a reactor core shielding assembly, covered in a spiderweb of calculations, annotations, and my own frantic, coffee-stained notes. My capstone project. The culmination of 4 years of physics, calculus, materials science, and the relentless, demanding mentorship of Commander Rostova. It was a beast, and it was due in 3 weeks. David found me later that evening, staring at the schematic as if I could burn the answers into my brain through sheer force of will. The room, once a stark cell, was now a lived-in sanctuary of organized chaos. Textbooks were stacked with geometric precision, but our desks were glorious wrecks of engineering ambition. "Still trying to solve neutron flux with the power of your mind, Mitchell?" David asked, dropping his own heavy bag by his bunk. "I told you, you need to actually write the equations down. Pen and paper, old school." I leaned back, my chair groaning in protest, and rubbed my eyes. The equations are the easy part. It's the material composition that's the problem. The theoretical attenuation doesn't match the practical stress tolerances. It's like trying to build a castle out of sand and expecting it to hold back the ocean. David peered over my shoulder, his sharp eyes scanning the diagrams. "You're overthinking the boron carbide layer. Rostova said it herself during the last symposium. Sometimes the simplest, most elegant solution is the right one. You're trying to reinvent the shield instead of just making it better." He clapped me on the shoulder. "You need a break. Your brain is fried. Come on, chow call in 10. I heard it's meatloaf night. A truly tragic culinary event, but the calories are real." I smiled faintly. David had been my anchor since that first disorienting day when he'd been unceremoniously tossed into this room as my new roommate. His wit was a weapon he used to deflect the absurdity of our existence, and his intellect was a whetstone against which I could sharpen my own. We'd spent countless nights like this, pushing each other through the academic crucible. A week later, I was home. The word felt different now. Annapolis was home in the daily, grinding, meaningful sense. This town, this house with its familiar scent of lemon cleaner and simmering soup, was my origin point. It was a surreal feeling, stepping out of my truck, my posture unconsciously straight, my duffel bag slung over a shoulder that felt broader than it had at 18. My mother, Sarah, burst through the front door before I'd even reached the steps, wiping her hands on a dish towel. Her hug was fierce, a little longer than usual, as if she were checking to make sure all my parts were still there. "Look at you," she said, pulling back, her eyes shimmering. She didn't say "my little boy." She didn't have to. I could see the words in the way she looked at me, a mixture of awe and that ever-present, quiet anxiety that had colored every phone call, every letter. "Hey, Mom." House was exactly as I'd left it, but smaller. I felt like a giant in a dollhouse. We ate a meal she'd spent all day preparing, and I told her about my classes, about my squad, about David's latest scheme to reprogram the coffee machines in the wardroom. I carefully edited out the sleepless nights, the moments of crushing pressure, the times I'd questioned every life choice that led me to the academy. I told her about the capstone project, and her eyes lit up with a nurse's practical fascination. "So this shield, it's to protect the sailors from the reactor?" she asked, passing me another helping of mashed potatoes. "Exactly. It's about maximizing protection while minimizing weight and volume. Every pound saved is a pound of fuel or supplies the ship can carry." She nodded, a professional appreciating an elegant solution to a practical problem, like finding a better bandage that sticks better but breathes more. Her analogy was perfect, and it made me smile. This was the language we spoke, substance over show. The following afternoon, she sent me to the grocery store for cream, a forgotten ingredient for a pie. It was in the dairy aisle, surrounded by the mundane chill of milk and butter, that the past decided to reintroduce itself. I was comparing expiration dates when a voice, dry and familiar as dust, spoke from behind me. "Mitchell, Lucas Mitchell, I almost didn't recognize you." I turned. Arthur Finch stood there, holding a small basket containing a single bottle of expensive olive oil. He looked exactly the same tweed jacket, though bulkier for the winter, the same perpetually disappointed set to his mouth. Time had not softened him, it had only etched his disapprovals more deeply. "Mr. Finch," I said, nodding. My voice was calm, neutral. Inside, a younger version of me flinched, bracing for the inevitable critique. He looked me up and down, taking in my posture, my short haircut, the way I held myself. It was a clinical, dismissive inspection. "Home for the holidays, are you? I must say I'm surprised you're still at it. I rather thought you'd have, well, moved on by now." He gave a thin, humorless smile. "Still just playing soldier down in Maryland." The phrase was a deliberate jab, a precise recreation of the sentiment he'd expressed to me 5 years ago in his classroom, when I'd told him I'd accepted my appointment. D said a military college was a vocational school, a place for technicians, not scholars, that I was wasting a first-rate mind on a second-rate education, that I was choosing to be a soldier instead of a scientist. The old anger, hot and defensive, flickered in my chest for a second. I felt my jaw tighten. But then I thought of the schematic on my floor. I thought of standing in front of Commander Rostova, defending my calculations on the whiteboard until they were flawless. I thought of the plebes who called me sir. The anger didn't vanish, but it was subsumed by something colder, more solid. Confidence. I met his gaze, and I saw a flicker of surprise in his eyes. He was expecting a reaction, shame, defiance, awkwardness. He wasn't expecting the calm stillness he found. "It's Midshipman Mitchell, actually," I said, my tone even. "And no, sir, I'm not playing. I'm in my final year, nuclear engineering." His eyebrows raised a fraction. "Engineering, well, I suppose that's a practical choice." The word practical in his mouth was an insult. "It is," I agreed, as if he'd paid me a compliment. "It requires a firm grasp of the fundamentals you taught us, more than I appreciated at the time." This was only partly true. D taught me physics. Commander Rostova had taught me how to use it to change the world. He seemed momentarily disarmed by my lack of antagonism. He cleared his throat. "Well, I'm glad to see you're applying yourself in your way." The moment stretched, charged with all the unsaid things. I could have walked away then. The younger me would have, seething. But the person I had become saw an opportunity. Not for revenge, but for demonstration, for proof. "Actually, Mr. Finch," I said, the idea forming fully in my mind as I spoke. "My capstone project, my dissertation, is in 2 weeks. It's on advanced neutronic shielding techniques for naval reactor cores. It's the culmination of the program." I paused, letting the technical language hang in the refrigerated air between us. "I think you might find it interesting. It would mean a lot to me if you'd come." The invitation hung there, simple and sincere. I saw the conflict on his face. His intellectual curiosity, his genuine love for physics, warring with his ingrained elitism. To come to Annapolis, to a vocational school, to see a student he'd written off, it was a challenge to his entire worldview. "A dissertation defense," he finally said, skepticism layering his words, "at the academy." "Yes, sir, we take our academics quite seriously there. Commander Rostova, my advisor, was a nuclear sub-officer. She doesn't tolerate anything less than excellence." I reached into my wallet and pulled out a crisp, white business card, a habit Rostova had insisted all her advisees adopt. I wrote the date, time, and building on the back. "Here, the security at the gate can be strict, but if you show them this, they'll direct you." He took the card as if it might soil his fingers, looking down at it with a bemused expression. He didn't say yes, he didn't say no, he just nodded slowly. "I'll consider it, Mitchell." I nodded back. "I hope to see you there, sir." I turned and walked away, my footsteps echoing on the linoleum floor. I didn't look back. I felt a strange, powerful sense of calm. The gauntlet had been thrown, the rest was up to him. The following 2 weeks were a blur of frantic preparation. I lived and breathed my project. David became my practice audience, grilling me with questions until my answers were instinctive. Commander Rostova held grueling mock defense sessions in her office, her steely gaze missing nothing. "The weakness is in the transition between the thermal and fast neutron absorption," she'd said during one session, pointing a laser pointer at my diagram. "An academic will seize on that. They'll say your model is too idealized. How do you answer?" "I acknowledge the idealization," I'd responded, my voice gaining strength. "But I argue that the computational fluid dynamics model, which accounts for coolant flow turbulence, demonstrates that the transition zone is more stable than a static model suggests. The idealism is a feature, not a bug, for the purpose of proving the core material science." A rare, slight smile had touched her lips. "Good, that's your thesis, own it." The day of the presentation arrived. I stood in a small, modern auditorium on the academy grounds, adjusting my tie in the reflection of a darkened computer monitor. The room was filling up. I saw my mother, sitting in the second row, her hands clasped tightly in her lap, her face a mask of proud nerves. David gave me a sharp thumbs up from the back. Commander Rostova stood near the door, a silent pillar of strength. And then, just as I was about to step to the podium, he appeared. Arthur Finch slipped into a seat in the last row, his tweed jacket looking out of place among the uniforms and casual dress of the other guests. He didn't smile. He simply sat, folded his arms, and prepared to listen. A fresh wave of nerves hit me, colder and sharper than any I'd felt before. This was it, the moment of validation or humiliation. I took a deep breath and walked to the center of the stage. The lights were bright, hiding the faces in the audience, but I could feel his presence like a cold spot in the room. "Good afternoon," I began, my voice clear and steady, carrying through the silent auditorium. "My presentation today is on the development of a graded zirconium hydride and boron carbide composite for enhanced neutronic shielding in compact naval reactor designs." For the next 45 minutes, the world narrowed to the glow of my slides, the smooth texture of the clicker in my hand, and the flow of concepts I had mastered. I spoke about neutron cross-sections, about radiation damage mechanisms, about the trade-offs between density and structural integrity. I was no longer a student defending a project. I was an engineer explaining a solution. The words came not from memory, but from a deep, hard-won understanding. During the question period, faculty members rose with pointed, challenging inquiries. I fielded them all, my answers concise and confident. I saw Commander Rostova nodding subtly in the front row. I saw my mother's nervous grip relax, a real smile spreading across her face. Then from the back, a voice I knew all too well. A question, Midshipman Mitchell. All eyes turned to Arthur Finch. He stood, his expression unreadable. Your entire thesis rests on the stability of the hydride phase under prolonged thermal cycling, he began, his tone that of a professor conducting an oral exam. Yet your cited literature only accounts for simulations up to 5 years. A naval vessel has a projected lifespan of 30. You're extrapolating data by a factor of 6. That's not science, that's speculation. How can you possibly claim your design is viable? It was the hardest question yet, the one that targeted the fundamental uncertainty in any new design, time. I felt a trickle of sweat down my back. I could feel the room's attention sharpen. This was the confrontation he'd come for. I paused, collecting my thoughts. I looked at him, not as my old tormentor, but as a physicist raising a valid, difficult point. You're absolutely right, Mr. Finch, I said, acknowledging the weakness head-on. A murmur went through the room. The long-term data doesn't exist yet, but the speculation, as you call it, is based on accelerated aging tests that model 40 years of wear in a controlled environment. Furthermore, the design incorporates a modular shielding layer specifically to address this uncertainty. If degradation beyond our models is detected, the module can be replaced during a standard refueling cycle without a full dry dock refit. It's an engineering solution to a scientific uncertainty. We build in redundancy and maintainability. That's the difference between a theoretical model and a naval system that must work, every time, under the harshest conditions on Earth. The silence in the room was absolute. I held his gaze. For a long moment, he just stared back. The dismissive arrogance in his eyes had been replaced by something else, a slow-dawning, reluctant respect. He had come expecting to find a soldier playing at science. Instead, he found an engineer who had not only mastered the science, but had also anticipated its practical limitations and engineered a solution. He had no more questions. He simply gave a single, slow nod and sat down. The rest of the defense was a formality. When it was over, applause filled the room. Commander Rostova was one of the first to reach me, her handshake firm, her eyes bright with pride. Outstanding, Mitchell. You handled that perfectly. I saw my mother talking to her, the two women from such different worlds sharing a moment of unadulterated joy. Sarah Mitchell, the nurse from a working-class town, and Commander Evelyn Rostova, the nuclear officer, connected by their belief in me. I looked toward the back of the room. Arthur Finch was standing by the door, as if unsure whether to leave or approach. I excused myself and walked toward him. He watched me come, his expression complex, stripped of its usual condescension. Midshipman Mitchell, he said, the title sounding natural on his tongue for the first time. That was a remarkably robust defense. Your understanding of the material is considerable. It was the closest I would ever get to an apology or a full concession from him. Thank you for coming, sir, I said. It meant a lot. He nodded again, a man whose certainties had been rattled. You've clearly found your path. He turned and walked out, a solitary figure retreating from a world he had never understood until today. I stood there for a moment, watching him go. The static of plebe summer, the doubt, the heat, the humiliation, it was all gone. In its place was a quiet, steady hum of purpose. I was no longer just a student. The crucible had done its work. I was an engineer. The white service dress uniform felt heavier than it ever had, the weight of 4 years woven into the wool. I stood before the mirror in my room for one last morning, and adjusted the high collar. The gold buttons, each emblazoned with an anchor, gleamed under the fluorescent light. My cover sat on the desk beside my bed, its patent leather bill a dark mirror. David was already gone, a whirlwind of efficiency, off to ensure our company was forming up correctly. The silence in the room was a physical presence, thick with memory. I ran a hand over the sleeve, my fingers tracing the subtle ridge of the gold-striped midshipman insignia. It was just thread and cloth, but it felt like a geological layer of my life. 4 years. It felt like a lifetime and the blink of an eye. I remembered the first time I'd put this uniform on as a plebe, all sharp angles and nervous sweat, the fabric stiff and unfamiliar, a costume I hadn't yet grown into. Now, it was a second skin. The crisp lines were no longer a regulation to be feared, but a statement to be worn. This was the uniform of a United States naval officer. My uniform. The sun was already climbing, a pale gold light filtering through the window and catching the dust motes dancing in the air. Down in Tecumseh Court, the brass band was warming up, the distant, brassy notes of anchors away mingling with the murmur of 1,000 families gathering in the stands. I could feel the vibration of the day in my chest, a low hum of anticipation and finality. My eyes fell on the stack of binders and textbooks piled by the door, ready for the final purge. On top was my capstone project, bound in a blue cover, a multi-physics approach to neutron shielding optimization in a compact naval reactor core. I'd handed it in to Commander Rostova 3 days ago, my hands trembling not from fear, but from sheer exhaustion. The all-nighters with David, the endless simulations that crashed, the equations that covered every whiteboard in our room, it was all there, condensed into 200 pages of the hardest work I had ever done. Rostova had taken it without a word, her sharp eyes scanning the abstract. She'd given a single, curt nod. "I'll have notes for you after graduation, Mr. Mitchell," she'd said, and dismissed me. It was the highest praise I could have hoped for. A knock came at the door, 2 sharp raps. It swung open before I could answer. David stood there, his own uniform impeccable, a grin splitting his face. "Mitchell, you planning on gazing at your own reflection all day? The brigade isn't going to form itself, though I understand the temptation. We do clean up nice." I snorted, grabbing my cover. Just making sure I remember how to tie a tie. It's been a while since we had a formal parade. "It's like riding a bike, except the bike is a noose and you're being judged by a bunch of admirals," he said, leaning against the doorframe. "You ready?" The question hung in the air. Was I ready? Ready to leave this place? Ready for the fleet? Ready to be responsible for the controlled sun we called a reactor, for the lives of the sailors who would serve with me? The ghost of a headache, a leftover from the capstone, pulsed behind my eyes. I thought of the endless grind, the moments of sheer terror in Rostova's classes, the brutal physical trials, the pressure that felt like it would crush me into diamond dust. I thought of the night land nav exercise just a few weeks ago, leading my plebes through the dark, the responsibility for them a tangible weight in my rucksack. "No," I said finally, meeting his eyes, "but let's go anyway." David's grin softened into something more genuine, the bond of shared suffering and triumph passing between us without a word. "That's the only answer," he said. "Now move your ass. My mother flew 3,000 miles to see this, and I'd prefer not to be late because my roommate was having an existential crisis." The ceremony was a blur of precision and pageantry, a spectacle designed to humble and inspire. We marched onto the field, a sea of white and gold, a single organism moving with 1,000 synchronized hearts. The sun beat down on the parade deck, and I could feel the heat radiating up through the soles of my shoes. The stands were a mosaic of color and proud faces. I found my mother immediately, a spot of vibrant blue in the 3rd row, her hand already waving frantically the second our company was called to attention. Even from this distance, I could see the glint of tears on her cheeks. The speeches were given, full of lofty ideals and calls to service. I heard the words, but they filtered through my own reflections. I wasn't the same boy who had stood on this field for induction day, scared and alone. That boy had been forged in this place. The academy hadn't just given me an education. It had taken my raw material and subjected it to immense pressure, and what emerged was something harder, sharper, and more resilient. It was more than nuclear physics and thermodynamics. It was learning that leadership wasn't about being the loudest voice, but about earning the quiet respect of your team. It was about integrity, about doing the right thing when the reactor was humming along perfectly and no one was watching, because that was when it mattered most. It was about the profound, gut-wrenching responsibility that came with the knowledge I now carried. As the superintendent began to call names, the long, slow march across the stage began. Each step forward was a step away from one life and into another. When my turn came, I walked with a back straightened by 4 years of discipline, my head held high. I shook the admiral's hand, felt the crisp parchment of my diploma placed in my other hand, and saluted. The applause was a roaring ocean in my ears. In that moment, I wasn't just Lucas Mitchell, graduate. I was Ensign Mitchell, United States Navy. The second the ceremony was dismissed, the rigid formality of the brigade shattered into a chaos of joy. Hats flew into the air, whoops and cheers erupted, and the field became a swirling mass of white uniforms and proud families. I was immediately enveloped in a hug that smelled of shampoo and unconditional love. "My boy," my mom whispered into my shoulder, her voice thick with emotion. "My brilliant, wonderful boy." She pulled back, her hands on my shoulders, her eyes searching my face. "Look at you, just look at you." "I did it, Mom," I said, and the simple words felt inadequate for the torrent of feeling behind them. "You did more than that, Lucas. You became someone incredible." Her anxiety, the constant undercurrent of her phone calls for 4 years, had finally stilled, replaced by a pride so fierce it shone from her. David found us a moment later, his own parents in tow, beaming. After introductions and a flurry of congratulations, he pulled me aside. "So, the nuclear cynic himself is here," he said, his voice low. "Finch." I saw him in the stands. Looked like he'd swallowed a particularly sour lemon throughout the entire commissioning oath. I followed his discreet glance and saw him. Arthur Finch stood apart from the celebrating crowds, looking oddly small and out of place amidst the naval splendor. He was watching me, his expression unreadable from this distance. A part of me, the 18-year-old who still lived in a corner of my mind, felt a cold spike of anxiety. The rest of me felt a profound calm. "I should go talk to him," I said. David clapped me on the back. "Go get your closure, Mitchell. We'll be at the car. Mom wants to take approximately 10,000 more pictures." I made my way through the throng, the newly minted ensigns and their families parting around me. Mr. Finch saw me approaching and straightened his posture, a familiar gesture of academic authority that now seemed faintly pathetic. "Mr. Mitchell," he said as I stopped before him. His voice was the same, the dry, precise tone that had dictated the laws of the universe to my high school class. "It's Ensign Mitchell now, sir," I said, not with correction but with a simple statement of fact. A faint flush touched his cheeks. "Yes, of course, my congratulations." He paused, his eyes scanning my uniform, the gold stripes, the diploma I held in my hand. He seemed to be searching for the right words, an unfamiliar struggle for a man who always had a lecture prepared. "I must admit, I owe you an apology." I waited, saying nothing. The silence stretched, forcing him to fill it. "I was wrong," he said, the words clearly costing him. "I dismissed this path out of hand. I believed a true education, a rigorous intellectual pursuit, could only be found within the traditional liberal arts university system. I thought this was, well, a trade school for soldiers." He gave a small, self-deprecating shake of his head. "I attended a lecture last night at the museum. One of your professors, a Commander Rostova, was speaking on the ethical and thermodynamic challenges of next-generation naval propulsion. It was formidable. The depth of the physics, the synthesis of ethics, leadership, and hard science, it was a humbling experience." He looked at me, and for the first time there was no condescension in his gaze, only a weary respect. "You were right to choose this path. The education you received here, it is profound. It is real. I failed to see that the most demanding intellectual pursuits are those fused with unimaginable responsibility. I am sorry for my lack of vision." I looked at this man who had been such a powerful specter in my mind for 4 years, the embodiment of the doubt I had to overcome. His apology was everything that young, angry Lucas had wanted to hear, and now that I had it, it felt strangely weightless. His validation was no longer the prize. The prize was the knowledge in my head, the confidence in my stride, the friendship of a man like David, the respect of a leader like Rostova, the proud tears of my mother. "Thank you, Mr. Finch," I said, my voice even. "It was a difficult road, but the hardest things usually are." I extended my hand. He took it, his grip firmer than I expected. The gesture wasn't about forgiveness, but about closure. A chapter definitively closed. "What will you do now?" he asked, releasing my hand. "I report to Nuclear Power School in South Carolina in 3 weeks. After that, prototype training. Then, hopefully, a ship." He nodded, a jerky, academic motion. "A ship? Well, I shall follow your career with interest, Ensign Mitchell." I left him then, standing alone in the fading excitement of the field. The apology had been given, and it was a nice piece of symmetry, a loose thread tied off. But it wasn't the point. The point was waiting for me by the car. My mom and David were leaning against the family sedan, laughing about something. The sun caught the water of the Severn River behind them, making it sparkle like 1,000 scattered diamonds. Mom had her arm linked through David's, already claiming him as a second son. "How'd it go with the ghost of academic past?" David asked, raising an eyebrow. "He apologized," I said, shrugging, "said he was wrong." My mom's face lit up. "Oh, Lucas, that's wonderful, after all he said to you." "It doesn't matter, Mom," I said, cutting her off gently. "It really doesn't. He thought he was the standard I had to meet. The standard was always here." I gestured at the sprawling campus, the granite buildings, the chapel spire piercing the blue sky. The standard was Rostova's impossible exams. It was getting my plebes through that land nav course. It was you, David, not letting me quit during the capstone. That's the education. It's not a collection of facts, it's the forging. We stood there for a moment, the three of us, a small island in the stream of departing families. The sound of the band was gone, replaced by the sigh of the wind and the distant cry of gulls. "I'm so proud of you," my mom said, her voice quiet now, sure. "I know," I said, and I finally felt the truth of it deep in my bones. David slung an arm around my shoulder. "All right, enough deep stuff. I'm starving. Your mother promised me the biggest crab cake in Maryland, and you're buying Ensign." I laughed, a real free sound. "Deal." As we got into the car, I took one last look back at the academy. The chapel stood serene and eternal on its hill, its silent presence a guardian of all the tradition, the struggle, and the triumph it had witnessed. I wasn't just carrying a diploma. I was carrying a reactor's hum, the sound of my company marching in step, the feel of a saluted hand, the weight of a promise made. It was the fusion of every equation, every leadership lesson, every moment of doubt conquered. It was the only education that could have ever prepared me for what came next. I was ready.